About an hour east of Melbourne lies a little quiet ex-logging town called Warburton. And towering above that town more than 1,000 metres is the sometimes snow-capped peak of Mount Donnabuang. Now, Donnabuang is interesting because it was originally one of Australia's oldest ski resorts, but these days really it's more of a playground for cyclists and for sightseers. And for cyclists, really, the appeal is in that combination of challenge and reward that it presents. You see, with Donnabuang, the moment that you roll out of the town of Warburton, you're already heading up the hill for more than 17 kilometres of uphill. And as you start climbing on this twisting and winding and crooked road, you're starting to climb through these wet pockets of ferns and dense forest. And it's amazing, you feel encapsulated by the area. You get this smell of damp earth and wet forest floor. It's really quite beautiful. And as you're climbing and grinding away, you look out over your shoulder and you can see the township of Warburton. And in fact, you get views across the entire Yarra Valley. It's really quite beautiful, but at the same time, it doesn't hide the fact that it's a really brutal climb. It's quite funny because you'll be riding along and in the background you'll hear other cyclists panting and sweating and grinding and probably cursing a little bit as well as they grind their way up those 17 kilometres of uphill. And it's 17 kilometres uphill the entire time. And for most cyclists it takes around about an hour and a half, and that's an hour and a half of constant uphill. Basically, if you're not riding forwards, you're going backwards. So it's that setting that made it even more incredible that just 3 weeks ago today, 20 incredible and inspiring women set out to ride not just one lap of Donnabuang, but repeat after repeat after repeat of that. They started at midnight and they finished after 10 o'clock at night the following night, setting out to climb the equivalent height of Mount Everest. Now, from the time that they left at midnight, right through till the time when the last rider finished at after 10 o'clock at night, they were never alone. They were surrounded by people the entire time. People came out to roll laps with them. There were barbecues that were set up and packed down. Some people came out, watched a little bit, went home, had a sleep, some breakfast in the morning, and came back out again to watch them. It was quite incredible, and over the period of those 22 hours that the girls were on the bike, there were more than 500 spectators that came out specifically to watch these girls. These 20 women, when they did eventually climb the equivalent height of Mount Everest, actually were the largest group ever to complete that particular challenge. They joined a group of more than 400 riders from 24 countries including Spain and France and Germany, even the UAE and Taiwan, and believe it or not, the Canary Islands. What they'd done was they'd completed what the UK's largest cycling publication called The Latest Climbing Craze, and what a journalist from Channel 9 News called the world's most exclusive club. What they'd done is they completed it in Everesting. Now, Everesting is a fiendishly simple concept when it comes down to it. You pick any hill, anywhere in the world, and you ride up and down and up and down and up and down until you've climbed the equivalent height of Mount Everest. And it sounds simple, but as you can probably imagine, it's anything but. So the fastest rider to ever complete an Everesting did it in around 9 hours, and I think the longest one's around 40 hours constantly on the bike of riding up and down. But for the majority of people, it's around about 20 hours on the bike, and that's 20 hours constantly of riding up and down a hill. Now, I've done 2 Everestings myself, and I can tell you this is going to sound a little bit strange, but those first 10 hours are actually not too bad. It sounds a little bit ridiculous, but it's not too bad. It's when you've been on the bike for 15 hours constantly riding uphill that things really start to break down. And when I talk about breakdown, I mean everything starts to hurt. Now, it's a given. Of course your legs hurt. Like, we can all imagine that. But your elbows hurt, and your shoulders and your neck hurts, and your back, and for some reason the tips of your fingers hurt, and even the balls of your feet hurt. It's ridiculous. Everything starts to break down. And the other thing that's a little bit soul-destroying about doing an Everesting is the mental breakdown as well. So for most cyclists, the reason why we climb up hills is, of course, so you can go tearing down the other side. And as you can imagine, after 15 or 20 hours on the bike, as you're starting to lose your mental stability, and you're flying down the hill at 60 or 70 kilometres an hour in essentially nothing more than a pair of underwear. It's not really ideal. So I guess maybe to put it in context a little bit, like to get your head around what an Everesting might look like, who here is familiar with the Anderson Street Hill on the Tan? Who knows that hill? Yeah, you know, like you're out, it's a beautiful day, it's sunny, you've got the crunch of gravel under your feet, you're running around with some of your mates there, and then you round the corner and then all of a sudden, boom, there it is, that Anderson Street Hill, just there to kind of wreck your day a little bit. Well, that hill was actually Everested last March by a guy by the name of Mike Williams. And Mike actually climbed that hill 352 times. It's crazy. He was out there for 24 hours. It was absolutely ridiculous. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit about the concept, and I guess it's probably because I've had a little bit to do with its introduction myself. See, for me, I was always inspired by stories of mountaineering. I would read books about mountaineering ever since I was little, and I think it was probably the idea that it was something so big and scary, and I knew I'd never do it myself, that maybe I could live vicariously through those stories. And there were stories of mountaineers getting caught in avalanches, of losing fingers and toes to frostbite, of being out in the mountains for not just a day at a time, but months and months on end. And I love the idea that these guys were doing something so big and so monumental that it would take them months and months and sometimes years to train up for and to save for to actually do it. And that inspired me to take on challenges in my own life. I loved trying to get into that headspace of these mountaineers, these crazy guys out in the snow, and trying to understand exactly why they did it. Not just because it was there, but what was it that drove them? And it was that idea that would continually drive me and motivate me to take on my own challenges. And I think part of that idea was the idea of pushing your body to the absolute limits of what it was actually capable of and what was possible. And I think part of that appeal was probably in the idea of suffering. I for some reason, it's a sick part of me, but I think I enjoy suffering a little bit. And it's probably no surprise then that I was attracted to cycling as a sport, because cycling really is all about the pain and suffering. And I'm not just talking about those little seats that we sit on for hours on an end, but like here's a sport where the best riders in the world are not necessarily those with the biggest legs or the fastest sprints. The best riders in the sport are the guys that can suffer the hardest and the most. So it was about 10 years ago that I started to get into cycling, and with a couple of cycling buddies, I quickly went about riding every single event that was possibly available. We did the 3 Peaks, we did Around the Bay in a day, we did the rides out to King Lake and the events that were held out in the Otways, and they were all fun, don't get me wrong, but the reality was they didn't quite provide the challenge that we were looking for. They weren't testing our limits by any means. These were all rides that we could wake up in the morning and go out and do. I really liked the idea of having a challenge that you had to work towards over the period of a couple of months, something that would provide some motivation to get through those dark, cold winters in Melbourne. So we just decided to create our own challenges. We call these challenges epics, and we picked one every year, and that was our whole training focus for the entire year. So for example, like what we wanted to do was take an existing concept and absolutely flip it on its head. We wanted to make it more difficult, and we wanted it to sound impossible. And if we'd done that, then we knew we'd hit the mark. So for example, we'd heard of a rider who had climbed all of the 7 highest peaks in Victoria across a period of 7 days, 1 peak every single day. It was ridiculous. So we went out and did it in 2. And then the following year, to get to all of those 7 peaks, while the clock is actually ticking, there's more than 800 kilometres of driving that's involved. So we made some refinements to that. We tweaked the route that we were taking, and we set out and did it again the following year. We set a time of 34 hours, and that's 34 hours from the time we set out on that first mountain, drove all of them and finished at the top of the final 7th peak. And that record would stand for the next 5 years. Now the thing is, while we're out on these epic rides and we're spending so much time in the hills together, the problem is with a bunch of guys, you end up just chatting about how you can outdo each other and outdo that last epic. And it's probably the worst place to be on the bike because we're spending so much time thinking about how we can outdo this and make it more difficult than last time. And it was out on one of those rides that one of the guys said, "Hey, I've heard about this new event. It's called Three Peaks, and they're calling it the hardest one-day recreational ride in Australia. It's out in the high country. It's this brutal course that includes the 3 highest peaks around there, and people train up for months for this. So we decided to set out and maybe one-up it a little bit. So we rode the entire course, and when we got to the end, we turned around and rode the whole thing in reverse. And then just for good measure, we finished at the top of Mount Buffalo. Now that ride took in more than 500 kilometres, and it was more than 10,000 vertical metres in less than 36 hours. And at the time, we'd give each of these epics a name, and this one was so brutally tough and so hellishly hard that we decided to call it Hell's 500. And as you can imagine, these days with the internet, the news of this crazy ride that we did spread quite quickly. And we'd go to new rides and people would say, hey, you know these guys, these are those crazy Hell's 500 guys, and it kind of stuck a little bit. So every year these epics got longer and steeper and harder as we kind of went on. We picked this idea of a 300 kilometre ride in one single ride. We'd never done anything like it before, so of course we decided to do that in the high country of Victoria. And it was absolutely the hardest thing that any of us had ever done before in our lives. And the following year, we took an iconic climb in the Dandenongs. It's called the Crucifix. And as you can imagine, the name sounds like it's pretty descriptive, but because you do feel quite crucified doing this thing. But basically, the Crucifix is the 4 hardest climbs in the Dandenong, and it traces roughly a crude cross if you look at it from a map. And now this sort of ride it's a big ride. If you go out in a day and do a Crucifix in the Dandenong, that's not only a big ride, but that's a big weekend for you. Naturally, we'd never heard of anyone doing 2 Crucifix in a row. So for the epic that year, we rode 3. So the challenges were continually getting bigger and harder and longer every year. But as we did this, the fame and the interest in our fans grew and grew, and we now had a global audience that was interested in this. For the Crucifix, we'd knocked back at least 30 people that were interested in joining us for that ride. We just couldn't have that many people out on the road. And even somehow miraculously, if I was able to get all of the hundreds of people that were interested in completing an epic with us somehow in the one location, there's no way we would have been able to logistically run an event like that anyway. It was kind of at that point that I knew that if we were going to continue this idea of epics, that something was going to have to change. Now, it was during training in the early 90s that the mountaineer George Mallory, and this is George here, the mountaineer George Mallory was training for over a year to actually hike to the summit of Mount Everest. Not on a bike, he was mountaineering. And as part of his training for that, and again I mentioned he took a year off work to do this, he started cross-training by cycling. And the idea behind that is that it's great for building endurance and aerobic capacity. And George he's an engineer by trade. And so he'd fastidiously mapped out every single climb in Victoria, as you do, and he'd worked out all the different mountains based on their gradient and the length and the profile. And George had calculated that Mount Donabuang, the mountain that I described earlier, for a whole host of reasons, was the ultimate climb in Victoria. It was unrelenting. There was not one single metre of downhill, and it would be the perfect training ground for him to build his aerobic capacity as he was training up to climb Mount Everest. So George went out week after week and would climb repeats of Mount Donabuang. And for those of you that have ever trained up for something big, you know that the training can be quite monotonous, so you need something interesting to kind of break it up. So George set himself little goals. So George said, okay, well, if I'm doing 2 laps of Mount Donabuang, that's the equivalent height of climbing to Mount Kosciuszko in Australia. And George thought, well, if I do 4 laps, well, that's actually the equivalent height of Mount Kosciuszko. And eventually, later on in the training, he got to the point where he could actually ride 6 laps of Mount Donabuang in a row, 6 laps. And that was actually the height of North America's Mount McKinley. And it was around about this time when he climbed those 6 laps that he thought, well, since I'm training to hike to the top of Mount Everest, maybe I can, just for a bit of a fun target, aim to cycle to the equivalent height of Mount Everest as well, 8,848 metres. And so eventually, after 4 failed attempts and after 22 hours on the bike, George actually went and did it and he achieved his goal. He'd cycled to the top of Everest. And I should hardly put this as a footnote, but of course he went on to hike and plant that flag on the summit of Everest itself as well. And I'd read about George's account from his training ride in the early 90s a couple of years ago. And when I read that rather lengthy account, it sent goosebumps up and down my arms. I felt sick in my stomach because here I was, this seasoned hill climber, and I'd just been presented with something that I knew that one day I'd have to do. And it made me feel so ill inside that, well, I had to. It just made me feel so ill inside that I couldn't even talk to my wife about it for another 6 months. I couldn't even vocalize the concept. That's how big and scary it was for me. And as much as I tried to suppress it, it still kept on gnawing away at the back of my brain. Now, fast forward another couple of years, and here I was. As I mentioned, I'm trying to think of these epics for Hell's 500, things that weren't geographically bound, things that were big and nasty, things that would be challenging for people. And I thought back to a ride, the 300-kilometre ride that I did, and I kind of glossed over it before, but at the time, that was the hardest ride that I'd ever done in my life. 300 kilometres in the hills, more than 6,500 vertical metres of climbing in one ride. And as I went into work the following Monday after doing that 300-kilometre ride, I had a chat to my non-cycling buddies at work and explained what it was that I've done. And they're like, wow, that's great. So what else did you do on the weekend? And it kind of blew my mind. I thought at that point, there really needs to be something tangible that it's not just numbers on a page, but something that people can actually relate to. So I needed something non-geographic specific and something that people could hinge off. And I needed something big and epic. And then all of a sudden that bloody training ride from George Mallory back in the 90s popped into my head. And here it was. George had just ridden the biggest and baddest mountain in the entire world in our own backyard. So there it was, like all of a sudden it started to come together, these pieces of the puzzle started clicking together, and like a crazy person, I burst in my wife who was in the shower at the time, like, Tam, you got to hear this, it's incredible, blah, blah, blah. I think it was pretty much like that. I made absolutely no sense. I just blurted it all out. It was so perfect. Here was this concept that could be replicated anywhere in the world. You pick any hill, any mountain, and you just ride it repeatedly until you climb the equivalent height of Mount Everest, and you could have an Everest anywhere in the world. So it seemed too perfect, and instantly we came up with this idea, well, you could Everest that. It would be called an Everesting. So like anyone in this room, I did what anyone here would immediately do with an idea like this, and I Googled it. I punched in the term Everesting, and there was donuts. I got silence. It was crazy. It was the strangest thing, going to Google, punching in a term, and not finding anything. I thought, no, this can't be right. So I clicked through a couple of pages of Google, and I just couldn't find any results there. I checked social media. I tried other browsers. I tried other search engines, and it just didn't exist. But that's fair enough. I mean, I had just made up a term, so that's kind of understandable. But I went back and I thought, okay, well, as a term, it doesn't exist, but probably as a concept, people would have thought of this before. So I put in longer and longer string search terms. I searched for cycling, Everest, cycling 9,000 metres, big ride in the hills, anything that I could. I spent hours trying to find if this thing existed, and I just couldn't believe it, but it didn't. It was borderline spooky not being able to find anything on that concept. And at the time, it was absolute elation. Here I was, I'd uncovered something that didn't exist. It's such a rare thing. But the elation almost instantly turned to fear. Oh my God, if I'm thinking of this, then surely there's 100 other people that are thinking of this same concept. So again, like anyone in this room, I did what anyone would do, and I registered the shit out of it. I parked a domain name. I jumped onto social media and registered Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Tumblr and whatever the hell Google Plus is, I registered that as well. And before the end of the day, I'd already started the web design. So I started pulling together the web design. I'm writing code and I'm building a Hall of Fame, which at that time didn't even have one single entry in it. But before the end of the day, and in a small pocket of cyberspace, Everesting actually existed. Now I had the concept, and that was nailed. But I knew that I needed to put some framework around this concept. So I created a couple of rules, and it basically distilled down to 4 key rules. And the first of these rules was you had to be first. Now, I mentioned before that I've grown up reading about the romance of mountaineering. And the thing with mountaineering is it's all about whoever's first to plant the flag on the top of the summit, whether that's K2 or Arma de Blanc or the first to climb all 8,000 metre peaks, or Mount Everest. History just doesn't remember seconds, so it's all about being the first. And the thing is, with being the first, I really loved that idea that this would push people and drive people and create this fear of them missing out. If they weren't first, they were going to miss out. I knew it would create this race for people to tick off all the popular mountains. And then after that, it would force creativity as people had to really think about how they could achieve their own Everesting. The second rule was that it had to be one hill. You had to pick a hill anywhere in the world and ride up and down and up and down and up and down that hill until you owned that hill, until you could digitally chisel your name against that hill. The third thing was, it had to be one ride. And this is just a polite way of saying, no, you cannot sleep during this ride. It needed to be big and tough and monumental. It needed to be tougher than anything else that was out there, so it absolutely needed to be one ride. And the fourth rule was it had to be verified. In essence, what I needed to look for was some sort of proof. I needed to see that there was data to back up your claim. Now, there's 4 rules there, and eventually as time went on and people started to get involved with this concept, it spawned a whole lot of sub-rules. People would ask, what do I do if the battery on my recording device runs out? Can I sleep? How do I go to the bathroom? Can I stop for a meal? But of all of those sub-rules that were created, there were still those 4 key rules. And of those 4 key rules, it was really this last one, the verification, that was absolutely the most important. I needed to find some way to prove and to capture that data to prove that these guys had actually Everested somewhere in the world. Now, traditionally, when you're capturing data on a bike, what that means is you swing a leg over the bike and you switch on the computer, and the computer's attached to a little cord which winds its way around your bike and eventually down to a little sensor on the back of the bike. And that sensor would pick up a magnet that's attached to the wheel. It's pretty old school technology. And what would happen is as you ride, it would give a rough approximation of how many kilometres you'd ridden. And it's the same technology that existed, probably you might have even had it on your BMX as a kid when you were growing up. But more recently, what's happened with the introduction of GPS devices is that GPS devices have become small enough and cheap enough that they appear on almost every cyclist's bike anywhere in the world. And the beautiful thing about GPS is that the depth of that data that you can gather is so much more intricate. There's so many more things you can actually do with that data. And almost instantly overnight, a whole host of apps catering for cycling data sprung up. And they were really training focused. It was really about, okay, well, here's all your data and here's a way that you can house it and use it for your own training. But there's one app called Strava, which took a different approach, and these guys really hooked into that sense of community. And the difference with Strava was that you'd be able to not only see your own rides and have your own training data, but you'd be able to see any of your mates' rides as well. You could look at those rides and you could view them and comment on them. You could give a virtual kudos, which is a like, and you could share those rides as well. The other beautiful thing about Strava is that whenever you rode a certain route, you could see how you performed against anyone else that had ever ridden that same route, or even a particular segment of that route. And what that did was, that actually changed the way that cyclists behave on the road. So not only was Strava lending terms to the cycling vernacular, things like kudos and quam and com entered their way into cycling speak, but also it actually changed the way we physically rode. People now go out on training rides and they ride sections of their ride harder than what they usually would, just because of this app. And as I mentioned, it's the fact that you can see the rides of all your friends, and you can, if you do something big and monumental, for example, riding 8,848 metres, you can imagine that it's going to get noticed. So we had the rules, and we had the concept, and we had this platform in Strava that was going to help with collecting all that data. But the one thing that I knew was that this, if it was going to become a thing, couldn't just kind of peter into existence. It couldn't grow organically. It couldn't be started with one ride. Remember, it was all about being first, so I wanted this to explode onto the scene. I wanted people to be checking their feeds, and all of a sudden, oh my God, what's happened? There's this thing called Everesting, and if I'm not quick, I'm going to miss out. And in my mind, I kind of thought about, okay, how many people am I going to need to seed that? And in my mind, it was somewhere around 50 to 100 people. So the other thing, because it was going to explode onto the scene, it meant that I needed to keep it absolutely secret. No one could know any of the details about it, otherwise they would catch on before it was actually a thing. So I sought out to knock on the door of these 50 to 100 people that I was looking for, but before I did that, I also knew that this concept was bigger and tougher than anything any other cyclist had ever considered really doing. And even George Mallory, when I spoke to him about it when I was planning the concept, had his concerns about how tough and how brutal this actually was. So before people could even find out about what this next epic was, they needed to send me a qualifying ride of 5,000 metres. They needed to show me that they had the ability to do it before they even knew about what it was that this epic was. And to put it in context, a 5,000 metre vertical ride is more difficult than the hardest ride in one day of the Tour de France. So, believe it or not, 120 people submitted rides over the next couple of months. A lot of these people were doing a bigger ride than they'd ever done in their lives just to qualify for something that they knew nothing about. And they were sworn to secrecy as well. And it was only later on, after the launch of the event, that I actually found out that some people took that secrecy so seriously that they hadn't even told their partners or their family about it, which was probably not quite the intention. So 12 months ago, believe it or not, to this day, 65 riders eventually, because half of the people that found out about it decided that it was just too tough and too brutal, which also told me that I was onto something. But 1 year ago today, 65 people set out into the dark at around about midnight in multiple locations around the world, all solo, but all on their own hill, to go and achieve their own Everest. And of the 65, 39 were eventually successful, up to 36 hours after they set out. And those people actually, they set out and they completed their Everesting. It was absolutely incredible. And that attrition rate, 65 starters, 39 finishes, sounds really high, but the reality is it's actually over 50% these days of people that attempt to climb the equivalent height of Mount Everest. More than 50% fail. And that's 50% of just the people that I hear about. You need to remember, because there's this race to be first, so many people keep it so close to their chest that we don't even hear about half of the attempts that are out there. But basically these 39 people went out and they did it and they created it. And what did happen was that bleary-eyed cyclists were waking up all over the world and checking their news feeds and, oh my God, what's this thing? All of a sudden 40 people have done this crazy thing, crazier than anything we've ever heard about. And overnight, Everest had existed. And my phone went into a little bit of meltdown over the next couple of days as people were asking about this thing. What is this? Again, to put it in context, to hear about one rider doing this sort of ride is a big deal. So you can imagine the shock and horror in the cycling community when all of a sudden, out of the blue, there's 40 of these things out of nowhere. And it was in those next couple of days that I was contacted by a journalist from The Age. And he was really interested in writing a feature article about this new crazy concept that had come out. And a few days later, it was in the first couple of pages of The Age, a full-page spread on this concept of Everesting and what it was all about. And the comments that came through and the feedback from both cyclists and non-cyclists was so overwhelming that Fairfax quickly pushed it through to their entire network across Australia. And across that network, it was the #1 trending article for more than 36 hours. And if I thought my phone had been in meltdown before that, it truly went into meltdown now. Actually, funnily, it was that weekend. It was quite funny because I heard on 3AW that Red Simons was actually bemoaning the fact of the death of the English language thanks to this new term called Everesting, which that was a bit of a mark of success for me. But I was getting contacted in the middle of the night by journalists from overseas. Everyone wanted to hear about this thing, from cycling blogs to the biggest publications. They all wanted to hear more about what this Everesting thing was and what it was all about. And here we are, it's a year on and more than 400 people now worldwide have completed an Everesting. That's all the way from Gareth Barnes, who rode Cheddar Gorge in the UK. And that was more than 500 kilometres in one ride. And it took him more than 36 hours on the bike. Through to a local lad, his name's Damien Richmond, and he rode a steep little track in the Dandenongs next to the 1,000 steps. That's 3 times harder, 3 times steeper and 3 times longer than Anderson Street. That attrition rate is absolutely massive at the moment. And we do have a whole bunch of Ironmen who have actually done this event as well. And all of these people all agree but this is by far the hardest challenge they've ever done. It's not only the physical drain, but it's the mental drain as well. So 12 months on, and just 3 weeks from the event where 20 women set out and became the largest group ever to complete an Everesting, male or female. And it's safe to say that Everesting really has now become a movement. The term has etched its way into the cycling vernacular. You can go down to any cyclist cafe or any cycling store and they'll know the term. You can try it this weekend if you like, but they'll know what you're talking about. And not only has it worked its way into the cycling vernacular, but it's actually currently being considered both for Wikipedia and for the Oxford Dictionary. And I'll send that straight on to Red Simons as soon as it happens. The pipeline is absolutely massive of people that are planning an Everesting attempt, and we're constantly fielding questions from around the globe of people who are interested in how they can do it and how they can become more creative. And I think it's that creativity that's the exciting part. As those icons are being ticked off, people are being forced into picking more interesting and more creative routes. And if I'm kind of thinking back on the whole concept and how it really exploded onto the scene, I think about the key ingredients that really made it work, and I've kind of distilled it down in my mind to 4 key ingredients. The first ingredient is the name, Everesting. It was really important for people to have something tangible to grab hold of. Also a cool hashtag as well. But people needed to be able to grab onto this term, and whether you're a cyclist or not, whether you knew anything about this concept or not, you knew as soon as you heard the term Everesting that it was going to be something big and bloody monumental. The second thing was there needed to be a clearly defined goal, and this one was easy, 8,848 metres on any hill. You just had to ride repeats of it. And the great thing about having a clearly defined goal is you've got that end target, but also it's providing that flexibility within the framework of having a goal. So the users that were interacting with this could really make it their own. There was unlimited creativity within those parameters of the goal. The third thing was it needed to be scalable from the start. As I mentioned, I was faced with the problem of how I could make this concept non-geographic specific. Basically, all you needed to do to complete an Everesting was you needed a bike and a GPS unit and a hill. And look, there's guys that have done this in the Netherlands, so if they can do it, then you don't need too much of a hill. But you just needed to it just needed to be completely scalable. Now, from my side of things, it didn't matter if there was 1 rider, 10 riders, 100 or 1,000 riders that completed this. The infrastructure was set up in such a way that it catered to as many people as they wanted. And the last thing, it tapped into an existing app and an existing community. I wasn't setting out to modify cyclist behaviour in terms of the way they collected that data. And it's interesting because Dan asked me when we were preparing for this whether if I had the money I would have created an app. Like surely that's what you would do if you were creating an event like this. But the thing is, I probably would have created this app, but I would have been troubled with the idea of explaining the concept and promoting the concept, but then also trying to explain to people, well, here's where you download the app, and here's how the app differs from desktop to Android to Apple. And I know it would have been bogged down in the technical details, and I would have been asking people to learn new behaviour. So the key for really making this explode was to tap into something that already existed. It's a year on, and as I said, the pipework for this is absolutely massive. The concept has exploded in the UK, and it's set to be an absolutely huge summer over there. And this is going to sound a bit bizarre, but the emerging market of the US is actually just waking up to it now as well. And you can imagine when things take off in the US, which is one of the biggest cycling communities in the world, things will really start to get quite interesting. Quite crazily, Strava have actually approached us about a partnership. This is the world's largest cycling app. And the reason why they've approached us about this is because they're interested in how this concept can inspire and motivate their own members. Everesting, that's no doubt, really exploded into the scene, but the thing is, we really are just seeing the start of the growth of this incredible concept. So I'm going to leave you now, but I just thought I'd give you one little piece of advice. If you are sitting in the audience and you're thinking, yeah, I'm thinking about just going out for a lazy 20 hours in the hills, let me just suggest to you that you pick your hills quite carefully because you're about to get quite intimate with it. and just hold on to that really carefully, because it really is going to be a race to be first. Thank you.